Hello, my name is Ania Kolbuszewska. Welcome to Gallery Teachers Masterclass. In today's session, we will continue the topic of feedback giving. In our last session together, the elusive art of feedback, we spent some time talking about an important element of making our students better learners and better listeners, and this element is peer feedback. For the teacher, peer feedback may mean less work, provided, of course, that we prepare students well to give effective feedback to their classmates. We also said that when preparing students for peer feedback, we need to focus on two areas. First of all, we need to focus on appropriate content. And you may remember that we talked about 3 questions that students should be focusing on. The first is the question about aims. Where am I going? The second is about the progress relative to the aims that we have set. In other words, how am I doing? And the third question is, what can I do to improve my rate of progress? In other words, where to next? And here is where success criteria come in. You may also remember that setting clear success criteria helps students overcome the bias that they have towards accuracy at the expense of communicative success. And the second area to focus on in preparing students for peer feedback is talking to them about features of effective feedback. In fact, there is a very clear connection between one of the features of effective feedback and success criteria. We can only provide reliable information about what is good and what action needs to be taken if we know what success criteria we want to use. In other words, if we know what success looks like. So let's have a look at an example situation. Imagine that your teenage students are going to role play a job interview. They work in groups of 3, where A is the interviewer, B plays the role of the candidate, and C is the observer who will then, after the activity, feed back on A and B's level of success. But C obviously cannot assess the level of success if there is no frame of reference, if they don't know what success looks like. And this frame of reference is provided by feedback criteria. We can, of course, use assessment criteria which have been developed, for example, by exam boards. And here you can see an example from Cambridge English Language Assessment. But we can also create criteria ourselves, or we can involve students in creating feedback criteria. And if we do that, their sense of ownership and responsibility for effective feedback will be much, much higher. When developing criteria, the most important thing that we need to look at is the aims. And here you have some examples of aims. So for example, we could focus on accuracy. And here we are talking about all language systems. So it could be accuracy in terms of grammar. It could be accuracy in terms of pronunciation. It could be accuracy in terms of lexis or function. We could also be focusing on developing speaking fluency. We could also be focusing on developing vocabulary range or grammar range. But we could also be working on developing communicative strategies. For example, the ability to describe a word you need, but you don't remember or you don't know, and getting meaning across in this way. So if we're working on this particular situation, the role play of a job interview, then one of the aims could be developing topic-appropriate active vocabulary range, and another topic could be developing active grammar range. So for example, when we talk about vocabulary in the context of job interviews, then it would be vocabulary connected to experience. So your education, your work experience, or your voluntary work experience. And when we talk about grammar, in the context of job interviews, one of the most important skills is the ability to ask questions. So let's focus on what success looks like. Where do I go is in fact a question about what success looks like. And what success looks like is best expressed by the so-called can-do statements. Once we have a full and clear picture of what success looks like, we can compare the current performance to what we're aiming at. Now here, it's really important to make sure that this comparison focuses on what is good and what action needs to be taken, and not on what is good and what is bad. And of course, the second key part of feedback is how to make this change a reality. And this is where there are a lot of opportunities for making feedback collaborative. So make feedback a collaborative brainstorming session on how to move forward. To ensure that students use feedback or assessment criteria well, they need to practice, practice, and practice. The best way to do it is to start with very simple criteria, such as, for example, has the question been answered? In other words, let students do this before they can do this. So if we take again our previous example of a job interview role play, we could start with questions which are relatively easy to answer, such as, did you understand the questions and the answers? And next time you want to involve students in giving peer feedback, you can move forward and the criteria could be a little bit more complex. So for example, in terms of language, was question structure used correctly? And in terms of communicative strategy, did the candidate give full, clear, and informative answers? So to show you how this works in practice, I'm going to describe the key part of the process that I use with my students, a process which guides students to becoming independent and reliable feedback givers. And at the same time, this is a process which allows them to learn from giving feedback. So first of all, and as early as possible, I sit down with students and talk to them about teacher-led feedback. I tell them that I want them to benefit from the feedback I give them as much as possible. And in order to do that, they need to understand what happens and why it happens. And this is, in a way, building a foundation for the future. Now, the three questions that we discuss, first of all, are these: why give feedback? When is feedback effective? And what information do my students want from feedback? So let's have a look at each of these questions in slightly more detail. So why give feedback? Language learning, like any other kind of learning, is a process. Effective feedback, which focuses on what is good and what action needs to be taken, supports this process orientation. Goals which are related to actions or process develop habits and routines in learners instead of focusing on deadlines and on completion of tasks at any cost. Remember that pressure on completion of tasks at any cost can actually lead to cheating. Now, an additional issue is connected with the nature of the learning process itself. For most of you, this is nothing new. So let's very quickly look at the stages in any learning process. Ignorance is bliss is the stage of learning which scientifically can be described as unconscious incompetence. This is a stage where you don't even realize that there are gaps in your knowledge. Real learning can only start at the stage of conscious incompetence. And this is what Socrates described as, I know that I know nothing. I am aware that there are gaps in my knowledge, and therefore I feel the need to learn. The next stage is the stage of conscious competence. And this is a stage where, if you think, for example, about learning to drive a car, this is a stage where you thought you were never going to be able to coordinate the clutch, the gear, the blinkers, etc. But then, with lots and lots of practice, you get to the stage of unconscious competence. So when we think about driving a car, this is a stage where you drive without thinking what to do next. And if we're talking about learning a language, this is a stage where you simply use the language and you don't necessarily have to stop and think, what grammar structure or what vocabulary you need to use next. So here we've got this beautiful and neat process, but we all know full well that learning is a lot messier than this. Language is an extremely complex thing to learn and to teach, and very often the process actually looks like this. Now, the move from unconscious competence to conscious incompetence is something that I would like to draw your attention to, because this is something that happens a lot, especially with adult learners who have been learning English for quite some time. And this is connected with a situation where they have learned the wrong thing, the wrong piece of language, and they're using that wrong language competently and fluently. I'd like you to meet Michael. Michael is a COO at one of the biggest banks in Switzerland. He's 45 years old, and I have the pleasure of working with him on improving his English. In terms of his fluency, Michael is at around C1 level, but in terms of accuracy, there are still areas which he needs to work on. He's a classic example of an adult learner who has reached the unconscious competence stage, but part of his English repertoire needs relearning. So a lot of the work that we do together focusing around going back from unconscious competence to the level of conscious incompetence, so that we can then build up conscious competence and unconscious competence again. And this is precisely the process of relearning. Relearning can be a huge confidence hit. And so we really need to take care of the strong emotions it may cause in order to be able to provide a safety belt. And the way we give feedback is one way of providing that safety belt. Okay, so we said that language learning is a process like any other kind of learning. And so the emphasis on developing skills instead of a graded product reminds students to see learning in itself as their goal. Now, to support successful learning, we need to give students more opportunities for reflecting on how well they are doing in relation to their goal. John Dewey, who was an American philosopher, psychologist, and educator, said that we don't learn from experiences, we learn from reflecting on the experience. The second question that I discuss with my students is, when is feedback effective? And here we talk about features of effective feedback, which I think by now you probably know by heart, so I'm not going to repeat them. What I am going to say is that if you look at these features of effective feedback, you will see that they actually support process orientation. And the third question that we discuss is, what information would my students like to get from feedback? And this is an excellent opportunity to talk to them about what success in language learning looks like for them, about what kind of feedback they have been getting so far, but also about why I believe that the kind of feedback where we look at what was good and what action needs to be taken is beneficial for them. This is also an excellent opportunity for you as a teacher to understand where your students come from and why their expectations are what they are. Another benefit of this kind of discussion is that it makes students aware of the fact that learning is the process that they own. It's not something that the teacher manages. The teacher manages teaching, but it's the students who manage learning. The discussion about what information students want from feedback is a great introduction to talking about criteria for feedback. And it's here that I introduce the 3 questions with regard to content of feedback. First of all, that we always need to look at what we want to achieve. Then we need to look at how I'm doing in relation to my aims, to what I want to achieve. And finally, what I could do to make my journey towards the aim faster or better. When we talk about criteria, there is a feedback format which is very successfully used in mainstream education, and it's called TAG or TAG feedback, where T is for tell them what you like, A is for ask a question, and G is for give a suggestion. And if you look at the TAG feedback, this is really about defining what is good, tell them what you like, clarifying, ask a question, and drafting a way forward, give a suggestion. And what you can see on the screen now is an example of a TAG feedback sheet, which is a very simple but very effective way of guiding even very young learners in the process of giving feedback. And another idea which is connected with peer feedback, assigning each student a virtual buddy for a week or for a month, and that will really depend on how intensive the course that you're teaching is. The students will be giving peer feedback to each other in that week or in that month, and that fosters relationships, which is especially important when we talk about remote teaching. Feedback is not only what we give, we also need feedback, because in the classroom it's very important to check if students are with you and learning. And here are some practical tips to get feedback from students, and these ideas are good for both the face-to-face classroom and the online classroom. So one idea is to pause in the lesson and ask students to indicate their understanding using a different number of fingers from 1 to 5. Or you can ask students to use emojis. But we also need to remember that not all students are happy to share information about their progress with their classmates. So it's a good idea to create a communication channel where they will be able to give you feedback on their learning in private. And Google Docs are actually an excellent idea for this. One way of getting feedback from students on their learning is getting them to reflect by asking them to either finish sentences or to answer open-ended questions at the end of the lesson. And yet another way, checking questions. And these are the type of questions that we use when we either introduce new language or revise language. So for example, if we're working on the second conditional structure, we could ask questions such as, what time does this sentence refer to? And the answer is, of course, present or future. Is the condition possible in theory? Yes, of course it's possible in theory. Is it probable? Not really. So is this a pessimistic or optimistic conditional? And of course, it's a pessimistic conditional. Psychologist and author Edward Deci, who is well known in psychology for his theories of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, has listed 3 situations when feedback is not effective. And the first situation is when learners feel that they are too strictly monitored. And if that happens, they can disengage from learning. So monitoring is actually counterproductive. Another situation is when they interpret feedback as an attempt to control them rather than help them. And finally, because feedback is given to the whole group or in front of the whole group, they may feel that they need to compete with the others rather than achieve their own best. So what's the solution? First of all, anytime we monitor student activity, we need to explain very clearly why we do this. And also, we need to explain to students that they are actually only competing against their own best. We have said time and time again that one of the key concepts connected to feedback is the relationship between the feedback giver and the feedback receiver. So let's talk about relationships for a minute. Some of you may be aware that within the first minute of the first serious conflict within a relationship, it's actually possible to predict whether the couple are going to stay together or not. And this prediction is based on the presence or absence of a set of specific destructive communication styles, which are called the 4 riders of the apocalypse. Now, we know that the 4 riders of the apocalypse is actually a metaphor that comes from the New Testament, and it depicts the end of times. And the 4 riders represent conquest, war, hunger, and death. Dr. John Gottman, an American psychologist, uses this metaphor to describe communication styles that can predict the end of a relationship. And these communication styles are criticism, which leads to defensiveness, which leads to closing up, and which in turn leads to contempt. So let's have a look at these communication styles one by one. The first rider of the apocalypse is criticism. And this is a communication style in which we attack the character of the person. The antidote to criticism is complaining without blaming. This is also sometimes referred to as legitimate complaint or constructive complaint. When we complain without blaming, we focus on a specific behavior and we talk about our feelings and needs. And this will probably remind you of some of the practical do's and don'ts of giving feedback that we discussed in the first session of this series. And one of those practical guidelines was to separate the problem from the person. And criticism breaks this rule. And the second one was to be as specific as possible. And this is what we do when we complain without blaming. So imagine a situation when you have set up a tutorial with your student and they are late. You wait 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, and the student finally turns up. And of course, by that time, you're already quite angry. So when the student comes in, you burst out and you say, "You never think about how your behavior is affecting other people. I don't believe you're that forgetful. You're just selfish. You never think of others. You simply don't value my time." And let me say that I strongly believe that this is only a theoretical possibility, but we're actually going to use this situation because it shows a few issues very clearly. Now, this is, of course, an example of criticism, but in fact, it breaks a couple of rules of giving good feedback. And the first is using never. And the second is attacking the character of a person. So how can we rephrase this criticism to make it a legitimate complaint? Here is my suggestion. "I was concerned when you were running late for the tutorial and didn't call or text me. I thought we had agreed that we would do that in such situations." So let's have a look at this reformulated complaint. What features does it have? Well, first of all, I speak about my feelings in this situation. I actually refer to a specific situation, and I also talk about myself. I use the I statements. Now, to make it even more appropriate and more effective, I would suggest adding a positive need that you have in this particular situation. We looked at the first rider of the apocalypse, which was criticism, and we said that criticism leads to defensiveness. And defensiveness is, in fact, self-protection in the form of blaming the other side. So effectively, what you're saying when you go defensive is, "It's not my fault, you are the problem." So imagine that a couple are getting ready to go out in the evening, and one person is ready and waiting, and the other one is trying to finish a report that they need for work for tomorrow. So this person who is ready and waiting finally gets impatient and says, "We're always late because of your work." Now, this is, of course, criticism, to which the person trying to finish the report responds by getting defensive and says, "Then why didn't you help me with the housework? If you had helped me with the housework, I would have been ready ages ago." Now, the problem with defensiveness is that it leads to the remaining two riders, closing up and contempt. So what is an appropriate response? An appropriate response is taking responsibility, or at least part of the responsibility for the current situation. And I know that taking responsibility is not easy, but you have a choice. Either take at least some of the responsibility for the situation, or spiral down into a relationship which cannot be repaired. And in this particular situation, taking responsibility could look like this. So let's have a look at another situation where we can see the four riders of the apocalypse riding in. And this is a conversation between a parent and a teenage daughter. So here is the exchange, and let me give you a couple of seconds to read the beginning of the exchange. So as you can see, the parent is clearly criticizing and the teenager is clearly defensive. But we know that criticism followed by defensiveness only lead to closing up and contempt. So this exchange could follow on like this. And this is closing up. That's the end of the discussion. And what follows is contempt. So again, what would help? Taking responsibility. And yes, I know this is a little idealistic to expect that teenagers will take responsibility, but then why not? So the teenager could respond like this. Now, the important thing about this example is that it shows you have a choice when communicating. You can either go down the destructive way of the four riders, or you can stop the downward spiral and rescue the relationship. Now, when talking about communication and about how we can shape relationships in a constructive or destructive way, I would like to mention a model which was developed by Dr. Stephen Karpman quite a long time ago in 1968, but a model which is still as relevant as it was almost 60 years ago, the model of a drama triangle. Now, drama triangle shows the roles that we take on in difficult conversations and how taking on these roles prevents equality in relationships. And since this is a triangle, you're right in expecting that there will be three roles. And the first one is the role of a persecutor. When we think about a communication style which would be characteristic for a persecutor, it would be, it's all your fault. So persecutor is the person who blames others. The other role is the role of a rescuer. And again, characteristic communication for a rescuer would be, poor you, let me help. And the third role, and I'm sure some of you have guessed already, is the role of a victim. And the characteristic communication will be, poor me. Now, typically in interaction, we actually move between these roles, but generally we tend to start with the roles that we learned in childhood, very often from listening to our parents communicating. Now, I would like to show you an example, and for this we're going to use a situation which we also used in the first session of this series. So this is a group of teenagers. They are doing group work, they're working on fluency development, and in the course of the activity some students become disruptive, so the teacher stops the activity and manages the disruption. And afterwards, individual feedback is given to students. Now, when giving this individual feedback, the teacher may fall into the trap of a drama triangle and may take on any one of these three roles. So what would they say in each of these roles? As a persecutor, they would say, it's your fault that other students cannot concentrate in class and I can't do my work properly. As a rescuer, they could say, I'll tell you how to make sure nobody gets upset. Everything will be fine. And finally, in the role of the victim, the teacher could say, I spent so much time explaining, but you still don't behave the way you should. Now, the biggest danger of falling into the drama triangle trap is that if we take on one of the one-up roles, so the role of a persecutor or the role of the rescuer, we actually push the other person, in this particular example, a student, into the role of a victim. And from the position of the victim, the student is not gaining any beneficial insight into the situation, into their behavior, and so they have no chance of repairing it. But when we take on the position of the victim as a teacher, we push the student either into the position of a persecutor, which can lead to anger and aggression, or into the position of a rescuer, which is equally unhelpful because it leads to taking on responsibility for the teacher feeling hurt. So what's the solution? The solution is to go back to the do's and don'ts of giving feedback that we discussed in the first session of this series. And in this particular situation with a teenage group of students, I would say number one is separating the person from the problem. And the other do's and don'ts are, of course, related to the level of detail and in terms of language to using appropriate quantifiers. We also talk about who the feedback giver is, also appropriate time between event and feedback, and finally, the level of student participation. Now, to finish talking about feedback, I would like to say a few words about creating a culture of feedback and what elements will help us create this positive feedback culture. And the first element is our expectations. We generally set our expectations in terms of student behavior, in terms of completion of tasks, but we also need to talk about our expectations in terms of feedback. So who the feedback giver is going to be, but also how much students are going to be active in feedback situations. The second element is opportunities. Opportunities are what allow expectations to become realized. In other words, we have to give students a lot of opportunities in which they will learn to not only give, but also to receive feedback. Another crucial element is time. Learning to give feedback requires an investment in terms of time. And that means that if you pack your course full of language content, there may not be enough time for good and successful reflection on the learning experience. The next element is modeling. When we give feedback, we model for our students. And this can't be something that we just do for the students. It needs to be genuine. And the next very important element is language. It is through language that we shape the reality of our classrooms and our relationships with students. And that's why we have spent so much time talking about destructive and constructive communication styles, but also about the do's and don'ts of giving feedback on the level of the language that we use. The next important element is environment. So, for example, the way we arrange our classroom. Is it in tables aimed at discussion where people are facing each other, or is it in isolated seats or rows? And this will have an impact on how much supportive feedback happens in class. And last but certainly not least, routines. If we use certain feedback giving and receiving routines, feedback will quickly become not only familiar, but also accepted and safe feature of the learning and teaching environment. Finally, I would like to encourage you to check out our Gallery Teachers website with all the information that you need about Gallery Teachers workshops. And this is a source of fantastic resources for your continuous professional development. We know that reflection is crucial in the process of learning, and so to support successful learning, we need to give students opportunities for reflecting on how well they are doing in relation to their goals. This is because we don't actually learn from experiences themselves, we learn from reflecting on these experiences. Feedback is one of the ways in which we can create these opportunities for reflection. We know that students benefit most from feedback when they are active participants in it, because we generally learn best when we try to put into words how we felt about a learning experience, about what happened during this learning experience, and how it helped us move forward. And this is, of course, reflection. Reflection is also a way of getting feedback on student learning. One way of finding out how students are doing in terms of their learning is getting them to reflect by, for example, asking them to finish sentences or by asking them to answer open-ended questions at the end of the lesson. So ideally, feedback includes reflection on the learning experience. And this is true about both the feedback that we give to students, but also about the feedback that we want to get on student learning. One of the most important reasons for teachers to educate students about ways to engage with feedback is that active participation on the side of the feedback receiver is a kind of guarantee of students benefiting from feedback most. Remember that we learn best by talking about our experiences, by trying to put into words how the learning experience has affected us, by making the effort to communicate our thoughts about this experience to the other person, in this case, the feedback giver. We also need to remember that learning happens not because of an experience, but because you take the time and the effort to actively reflect on that experience. And as we know, reflection is an essential part of good feedback. But what is equally important is to ensure that our students know that participating actively is a choice, and that no one is going to force them to reflect if they're not ready to do it. I believe that talking to students about how they can engage with feedback and why it's a good idea to do it helps students become more aware learners, more independent learners, and in the long run, to become effective, lifelong learners. Feedback is a communication skill which is always governed by the same principles, no matter if we give feedback in the classroom or outside the classroom. If we're talking about educational context alone, it also doesn't matter if it's feedback given by a teacher to their colleague, another teacher, or peer feedback between students, or feedback between the teacher and the student. The aim of feedback is always to provide an opportunity for the feedback receiver to look into a mirror in a way, and to allow this person to see what they do or what they did well and what they can do to further improve their performance. Feedback always needs to be efficient. If we don't prioritize and choose the most important things that we want to focus on, we risk getting lost in details. And finally, feedback should take into account the fact that we have some kind of a relationship with the person that we give it to, and that this relationship should not suffer as a result of feedback. This means that working on your feedback giving skills in one context, for example in your job, actually means that you work on something much more general, your feedback giving skills as a life skill.